So Billy Graham is dead, the evangelical preacher. He was 99 years old, so a lot of you probably only know him as, an old guy who would occasionally come out of the shadows and say something, or people would talk about him. But when I was a kid, he was like the Pope of America. He was like a fixture on television. He knew all the presidents. He was on talk shows. And if he made a comment about the news, it was news. I mean, he was that kind of important person. Now, in my family, which was a family of liberal East Coast Jews, I think we always looked at him as a little bit threatening. He was that part of America that was different from us and maybe excluded us and maybe was not welcoming to us. My father, I wrote about this in my memoir, The Great Good Thing. My father was a GI during World War II, and the news of the Holocaust, the news that 6 million Jews had been exterminated in this kind of mechanistic way, scarred him for life. It scarred my father for life. He was paranoid. And anything that he saw in politics, he was a liberal, and anything he saw that was conservative, that was religious, that was overly patriotic, he immediately thought that the Holocaust was coming again. And I don't mean that it wasn't like liberals now, oh, you're literally Hitler. He literally thought it was Hitler, So, I mean, when he would see a character like Billy Graham preaching the gospel, talking to presidents, talking about Jesus, 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 he just found it very, very threatening. And that was kind of the atmosphere in my house. It took me a long time to realize how entirely nuts this was, and to understand that in many ways it was people like Billy Graham who kept this country sane. It was people like him who brought it back to itself, who reminded it where it came from, of what the underlying ethos of our country was. He is the guy that the left usually hated, and yet even people like Dan Rather said when they went to investigate him as an investigative reporter, and then they heard him preach, they almost came to Jesus. They almost came down and gave themselves to the Lord. And I think that he, when I get a letter, as I occasionally do, that says something that I said or maybe my memoir helped someone find God in his life, that's probably the letter that makes me feel best, because it's not like, oh, I enjoyed your show. It's not like, oh, I enjoyed your novel. It's like an eternal win, It's like an infinite win. And I always joke that if I have enough of those, when I get to heaven, not only will they let me into heaven, but they'll give me a toaster, that you get an extra little bonus. But he did that to thousands upon thousands of people. I'm going to tell a little bit about that. All week long, we've been talking about what I think are fake crises. This gun crisis, this school shooting crisis. It's not that that's not a tragedy. It's not like it's not a terrible thing, but a crisis is something different. A crisis is something that if you don't get on it, if you don't stop it right away, it's going to lead to a disaster. That's what a crisis is. A crisis is something that if you don't turn it around, it's going to lead to a disaster. I do not think guns are a crisis in this country, and I certainly don't think the Russian trolling of our election was a crisis. We've been talking about crisis after crisis that doesn't exist, that is simply a tool that the media, which is the left, is using to take your rights away, to gain more power. In the case of the guns, it's to take your God-given right to defend yourself away. In the case of the Russians, it's to delegitimize Donald Trump, who they hate. But there actually is a crisis in this country that's real, and I think the passing of Billy Graham gives us a good reason, a good pretext to talk about that real crisis. Trigger warning, I'm Andrew Klavan. This is The Andrew Klavan Show.